Good to have you for week 5. Hard to believe that we are at the halfway point. Our ranks are a little bit thinner this morning. Maybe the beautiful weather, maybe people coming back from the Duke game. That was, if you're Duke, that was sad. And it was sad, and don't like to see anybody get hurt. And also CDS homecoming, which was a late night for some of our children. So you all were not at CDS homecoming, so congratulations. Good to have you here. As we come this morning to Anselm, every week as I prepare, I've had church history courses, and I know, but I'm learning lots of things along with you, which is what is fun about teaching, is getting to learn. And each week, as I get to this point, I think, you know what, this maybe is the favorite person that I've got to study this semester, and then we'll see what happens. I can tell you, Pope Boniface later, he is not going to be the favorite person, and Richard the Lionheart is kind of mixed, but it was great fun to study Anselm, and so you've maybe heard something about him, but I doubt that you have a real bead on his life. And Anselm, you can see his dates up there, 1033 to 1109, help us to get into this very critical half century at the end of the 1000s. Anselm was born in, I guess we'll say, Aosta in northern Italy in 1033. After his mother died, Anselm did not have a good relationship with his father. I don't know much more than that. But he left home and he set out to make it on his own as a young man. At the age of 25 or 26, he entered the Benedictine monastery at Bec, which is in Normandy. Think about, Americans, we would think storming the beaches of Normandy. Well, same Normandy there up in northern France. So Bec was a relatively new monastery. It had just been founded in the 1030s, so just a couple of generations earlier, but it had already had a great reputation as a center of learning. One of the things to remember about monasteries here and why they're so important from Benedict all throughout the Middle Ages is not only do you go there if you're a monk or women as nuns, but they became centers of learning. These were the private schools, as it were, that noblemen could send their children to, or somebody like Anselm, who arrives at Bec in 1059. He's a self-educated layman. So you could go there and say, I'm here to learn. Where are you going to learn? We don't quite yet have the rise of the universities. That's coming up in the next 100 years. Where do you go to learn? About your only option, unless you're nobility and you have a private tutor, is you go to the monastery. So he enters at 1059, and in 1060, the following year, he makes a decision to become a monk. This monastery was well known because it was the place where the abbot, remember the abbot is the father, one B or two Bs, the abbot. He was a man by the name, two B's, one T, named Lanfranc. And he, though you probably haven't heard of him, was very well known in the 11th century. He was the great scholar, the great teacher, and so just as you might want to go to some university for their prestigious faculty, you wanted to go to Bec so you could sit under the teaching of Lanfranc. And that's why Anselm went there. Lanfranc left in 1063 to become the abbot at a different monastery, and then in 1070, and this is very important, we'll see later, he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, so Canterbury in England. Anselm then became the main teacher at Bec, and eventually in 1078 was elevated to the role of abbot. Anselm followed in the footsteps of his teacher, mentor, Lanfranc, so he goes to Bec to sit under the teaching of Lanfranc. He leaves, and then Anselm, who had been the prior, that's like the person under the abbot, one of the key teachers and leaders, then after he leaves, Anselm becomes the abbot, and then Lanfranc, who dies in 1089. He had been the Archbishop of Canterbury since 1070. And then in 1093, Anselm, once again following in the footsteps of Lanfranc, he becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so this Italian-born scholar, monk, archbishop, pastor dies in Kent. That's where Canterbury is, in sort of the southeast corner of England, in 1109. It's a truism with each person that we study that you say they lived in momentous times. We all feel that, and you can make the case in every single generation, every single age. You can point to lots of key people, key events. And so that's true for everyone. And part of what makes each of these people we're studying so important is that they shaped their times and they responded and were enmeshed in many of the major significant events of their era. But it is especially true with Anselm, that he lived in the midst of a series of epoch-altering, history-shaping events and controversies in the second half of the 11th century. Let me mention to you, briefly I hope, 4 of them. So number 1, these are 4 key events, controversies happening in the second half of the 11th century, and they all did something to shape Anselm, and they created the world in which he lived and had to respond to. So first is the Great Schism of 1054. And this event, in many ways, would have the most lasting significance upon the church. Pope Leo IX was the pope in Rome, and his counterpart in the East was a man named Michael Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Let's just call him Michael. So Michael and then Pope Leo. There had been, if you've been a part of this class this semester or last year, you know that already with Rome in the West and Constantinople in the East, there had been a series of conflicts. It was always a kind of on-again, up-and-down relationship ever since, especially 476, when the last Roman emperor in the West is deposed. But you remember last week, Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne is given the crown as the new Roman emperor in the West. And this thing, which has come to be called the Holy Roman Empire, with a Holy Roman Emperor, is taken shape. So between the West and the East, there had been a series of conflicts. And really, for the last 500 years by this point, the two halves of the church had been in constant conflict. What did they argue over? Well, they had differences in language, Greek in the East, Latin in the West, and they couldn't always, wasn't that the Greeks always knew Latin, or those who knew Latin often didn't know Greek. They have different cultural context. They have different ecclesiastical organization. Their liturgy takes shape in some different ways. And at certain points, they have some different theology. Come back to that in a moment. The political situation was made more volatile because of what we saw last week with Charlemagne, the formation of this new empire with an emperor in the West, and also these papal states. Remember I said that the Holy Roman Empire, or Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom, included most of France, Belgium, Netherlands, parts of Germany, northern Italy, but carved out there were these papal states, which had become a kind of sovereign land of their own. So all of these things were just making the differences between East and West greater. From the Western point of view, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael at this point, was supposed to be under the primacy of Rome. So they, in the East, should have been under the supremacy of Rome. And Pope Leo IX did not like that Michael called himself, as many had done before. Remember, this upset Gregory the Great way back in the 6th century. That the Patriarch of Constantinople called himself the ecumenical patriarch. Well, that has sort of a ring of like, we're the one over this whole church thing, not so much you in Rome. The pontiff in Rome didn't agree with the claim that the patriarch of Constantinople had authority over some of the ancient bishoprics, like in Alexandria and in Antioch. And in the West, they didn't like that they allowed clergy to be married in the East. Now, we've seen before that it was very slow developing that priests could not marry. Bishops earlier were forbidden from marrying, but clergy were still married. And it's only here in the 11th century, even in the West, that it really starts to pick up steam, that we really want to make sure that the clergy are not married. Well, this didn't make sense in the East, so they disagreed with them on the issue of clerical marriage. And sometimes the Greeks in the East would rebaptize those who had been baptized in the Latin West. Well, that upset those in the West. You don't think our baptisms were good enough because they were done by Latins instead of Greeks? And according to the West, they didn't like the timing in which they practiced their infant baptism. They all did infant baptism, but they disagreed. East and West, should it happen on the 8th day like circumcision, or should it happen as soon as possible? Maybe it should be delayed until the end so you can be sure to wash away original sin. So from the Eastern point of view, that's the West, from the Eastern point of view, they're saying we never agreed that Rome would have control. When did we ever have an ecumenical council that agreed that the Roman bishop should have primacy over all the other bishops? Besides, Constantinople is much, by a factor of 10 or 20 times larger than Rome by this point. Whoever thought that Rome, which has been sacked by the barbarians multiple times, why should that be the most important city and church in all of Christendom? They also had some other disagreements that we might find more petty, but it's amazing. When you live in your own time, it's just hard to tell what are the issues that are really important that we're not making enough of, and what are the issues that later we'll look back and say, really, you were going to split over that? Well, they didn't like that in the West they used unleavened bread in communion, because they said, well, that's like Judaism. In the East, as I said, they didn't like that all the clergy were forced to be celibate. Hear, hear, good on for the Greeks on that one. And they also didn't agree that in the West they allowed people to eat animals that had been strangled. They allowed to eat meat that had blood in it. In one of the documents I read, said in parentheses, the Germans loved their blood sausage. And the theological debate, this is a history class, not a theology class, so we don't have much time for this, but is over this word filioque, which is Latin for and the Son. The Nicene Creed, the Council of Nicaea was 325. The Creed, as we know it, really came into shape at 381 in the Council of Constantinople. It said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Well, in 589 at the Council of Toledo, Spain, not Ohio, you're not that important, Ohioans, but they added in the West this one word, filioque. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So in the West, they saw that this was necessary to protect the equality of the Father and the Son. In the East, they thought that this undermined the sort of first in order of the fatherhood of God. But even more than the theological disagreements here, there were political, ecclesiastical. And you can't, even though here in the West, and I would defend the filioque clause theologically, you can't understand in the East, they said, now wait a minute. You added to the Nicene Creed without asking us? You just did this in the West, and now you say this is the new Nicene Creed, when this was an ecumenical council. In fact, didn't it happen in Nicaea, and then in Constantinople, over in our neck of the woods, and then you added to it. So this would actually become more pronounced in the centuries to come, but it was already a theological issue and part of what led to the disagreements between East and West. The divisions came to a head in the middle of the 11th century after the Byzantine territory in southern Italy was conquered by a group that would be very important, the Normans. Any Normans here today? We didn't have any Franks. All right, yeah, there you are. We didn't have any Franks last week. I don't know if we had any Charles. We got some Normans. So the Normans had conquered southern Italy. That had been the last holdout of the Byzantine Empire in the West. And so once the Normans conquered that, there was the last geographic link between East and West. So Michael, the Patriarch in Constantinople, orchestrated a very aggressive attack. And I don't mean a military attack, just a verbal, theological, political attack on the Western Church. Leo responded by reasserting Rome's supremacy as the mother church. And the two sides continued to thrash at each other. They declared each other's sacraments invalid. And in 1054, a papal delegation arrived at Hagia Sophia, a great church. Now the Muslims, when they overran Constantinople, Istanbul have it, but you can still go there, and it's a beautiful church, and you can see up in the dome, you can still see underneath some of the Arabic calligraphy, some of the Christian iconography. The papal delegation came, and they put right on the altar in Hagia Sophia a bull that, not a cow bull, but a written document bull that excommunicated the patriarch. Here we are, just wanted you to know, boom, you're out. Well, what did the Patriarch of Constantinople do? But he, in turn, excommunicated the Pope. It wasn't until 1965 that the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church rescinded each other's excommunications. So some healing, but still, this it didn't set out the East and West on different trajectories because that had already happened for centuries, but it cemented this division, which has never been overcome between the Latin West with Rome and the Greek East with Constantinople. So 1054. You're saying, are we ever going to get to Anselm? I'll take these next two more quickly. The second major event is the Norman Conquest. Good job, Norman. This is your day. You remember this from your history class, perhaps 1066. William the Conqueror, also known as William the Bastard, but he's done good PR work to just come down as William the Conqueror. And he comes with his army of Normans, and they land in England, and they defeat the force of the Anglo-Saxons, and William the Conqueror becomes the first Norman King of England there in 1066. And you'll see why this is important when we get to Anselm in just a little bit, because when William the Conqueror died in 1087, William's lands in Normandy, so remember that's just across the English Channel, the northern part of France, well, that's Normandy. He gave those lands to his oldest son, Robert. Well, he gave to his second son, England. So at this point, probably considered, what would you rather have, a little bit of France or England? Well, you rather a little bit of France. So he gave him England, and his name we'll come back to was William Rufus. William II, but he's known as William Rufus. So 1066, the Norman Conquest. The third event, which we'll deal with briefly because we'll have a whole class on the Crusades, is the First Crusade in 1096 to 1099. Jerusalem and the Holy Land had been under Muslim control for centuries. But by the 11th century, there was a new sort of Muslim dynasty in the Holy Land, the Seljuk Empire, and they were less lenient than many of the other Muslim dynasties had been. Many of the Muslim dynasties, although they overtook the Holy Land, they allowed Christians and Jews. They weren't forced to convert. They could practice as long as they didn't proselytize. But this new empire was more threatening, and they were seen to be a potential menace to the remaining Christian populations, and they appeared to be a threat to the whole Byzantine Empire in the East. So interestingly, even though the West and East have this split in 1054, now you have to remember, there have been several other kind of splits like this, but none of them ever lasted. So they probably, They didn't know when this happened, like, this will not be undone in the next 1,000 years. They probably thought, oh, here we go again. So by 40 years later, there's still enough of a relationship east and west that the Eastern emperor appeals to the West and says, can you come and help us? We got this Seljuk Empire knocking on our doorstep. And so the Pope, Urban II, agrees to send military assistance, and he urges the Latin Christians to make pilgrimages to the Holy Land and take back Jerusalem. Now again, we'll have a whole week on the Crusades, and lots of terrible abuses were perpetrated by the Christians in the Crusades. And yet, just to put ourselves in their mindset, you do sort of understand that in their mind, they don't think nation-state borders like we do. They think Christian lands, Muslim lands. And as far as they're concerned, this was the land of the Christians, and the Muslims took it over. So why wouldn't we have a right to come? And shouldn't we, in fact, try to liberate it from the Muslims? Well, against all odds, the First Crusade was actually successful. Lands were restored to the Byzantine Empire. Jerusalem was captured. 4 Crusader states were established in the Holy Land. And that was about the high point of the Crusades. The Second Crusade would be a catastrophic disaster. So those are the first 3. And then one more key event before we turn to Anselm himself. And this 4th event isn't so much a singular event as it is a series of related controversies around lay investiture. Lay here means like the laity, non-clergy, someone who's not a priest, not a bishop, not the pope. And investiture is like ordination and installation. Who gets to appoint and invest the priests, and especially the bishops or the archbishops in their various churches or cathedrals or bishoprics. So this was a major source of controversy. Lay investiture meant, for all practical purposes, it wouldn't have been just any of you, non-pastors can go just appoint and ordain pastors. What it meant really was that the king and the emperor could do it. Well, you can imagine who liked lay investiture. Well, the kings and the emperors. Who didn't like lay investiture? Well, most of the church, the bishops and the pope. And one of the reforms from Pope Gregory VII, who we'll see in just a moment, was to try to eradicate or at least reach some kind of compromise on this issue of lay investiture. And this would be a major issue for Anselm, as we'll see at the end. The most famous, most dramatic event surrounding lay investiture happened between Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV, who would become the Holy Roman Emperor, but at this point in their conflict is really the king of Germany and the king of Burgundy and a couple other things. But for all intents and purposes, think of Henry IV as having control sort of over that kind of landmass that we saw with Charlemagne, parts of France, Germany, up to Belgium and the Netherlands, and a little bit farther east now. So there was this conflict between Pope Gregory and Henry IV. In September 1075, Henry installed a new bishop of Milan. He deposed the old one, he installed a new one. So Henry thinks, I get to do this. This is what I do. I'm in charge of these lands, and so, bishop, you're gone. I'm going to install a new bishop. Gregory doesn't like this. Gregory is attacked a few months later while leading Christmas celebrations. Again, you think we live in a crazy time. They were crazier. He was taken to jail by a mob, attacked on Christmas. The next day, however, the Pope has a mob that sets him free from prison, brings him back to the church. He picks up the Mass right where he left off. So Gregory then orders Henry to appear at Rome. And he says, if you don't come, I know what you're doing with this lay investiture. If you don't come appear before me at Rome, your soul will be in danger of hell. Henry thinks, well, I'm not going to do that. I can't let the Pope, you're not the boss of me. I'm the emperor. And so he calls a council of his supporters, and they declare that Gregory, the Pope, you're deposed. And so Henry and Gregory have both said, you're not the emperor, you're not the Pope. They've both said, I have the authority to make and break you, and so no soup for you. Soon after that, we have the threat of excommunication from the Pope. It's one thing to say, I've deposed you as emperor, but now there's the threat of eternal judgment. And this erodes some of the support for Henry, because Henry's supporters think, well, if Henry, and we're giving our allegiance to Henry, and he gets damned to hell by excommunication, who's to say that the Pope isn't going to do the same thing for us? We may be just as cursed as he is. And so Henry loses support. He realizes he's in a precarious position, and he needs to get on the good side of the Pope. And so this is one of the most famous or infamous moments in medieval history. Henry hikes across the Alps in winter to meet Gregory at his papal residence in Canossa, and there he begs for mercy. You sometimes will still hear this expression, on the road to Canossa, which means somebody is on their way to do abject humiliation, contrition, and apology. So Henry is going to Gregory at Canossa. He's there in winter. He arrives at the papal residence, and Gregory will not let him inside. So there's famous paintings of this, and they're probably inaccurate, but they represent the moment well, that there you have Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, for all intents and purposes, though he's not that officially yet, waiting outside in the snow for 3 days, just begging that the Pope would let him in. And so finally, after waiting from January 25 to 27, 1077, he opens the door, and Henry begs for mercy, and Gregory pardons him. Now, interestingly, historians still debate who came out on top. You would think, obviously, this was a big win for the Pope. Your opponent, the emperor, comes and he has to beg for mercy. Although some historians say, well, actually, this was very shrewd of Henry, because he needed the Pope to forgive him, and he needed the Pope to come on his side. And so by waiting outside in the snow for 3 days, what's the leader of the church going to do? Well, I got to show mercy, I guess. Okay. You're forgiven. You might think, well, there's a happy ending to this story, but of course there is not. Henry returns to Germany. His enemies are emboldened. Wow, you are a weak emperor. You've had all these difficulties with the Pope. They rebel against him. Gregory, of course, is happy to have Henry's enemies rebel against him. They mount an attack on him. The rebels then elect their own emperor. Henry, however, eventually gains the upper hand over his enemies. Gregory decided he was still going to support the new emperor, so Gregory once again excommunicates Henry, although he had pardoned him at Canossa. But this time Henry's followers say, enough is enough. We're not scared of the big bad Pope anymore. And just as a rival emperor had been elected, Henry's followers elect a rival Pope. So, okay, you're not the Pope, we got a new Pope. You're not the emperor, we got a new emperor. Well, the rival emperor is killed in battle, so Henry once again is in a position of strength. He's the unrivaled emperor. He marches on Rome against Gregory. The only possible support for Gregory could be found from our friends, the Normans, but the Pope had earlier excommunicated them as well. So they weren't very keen to help him out. Eventually, Pope Gregory has no other recourse but to join forces with the rival Pope, Clement, and they finally get the Normans to intervene, and they push Henry's forces back, but Henry escapes. The Normans burn part of the city, they kill the inhabitants, they sell away thousands as slaves, and now Clement is the acting Pope. Gregory is in exile. He dies in 1085. Clement is ousted by Pope Urban a few years later, and good old Henry IV is eventually crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1084, and he lives in that role until he dies in 1105. So Henry IV got the last laugh. That's the most dramatic example of what we will see, I promise, with Anselm in this lay investiture. So let's turn to Anselm here for the second half of the class. And these events will help make sense of some of what Anselm is about. Anselm is most well known today, not for what he did, though if we have time we'll come to that, but for what he wrote. He is considered one of the forerunners of what we'll see in much more detail with Aquinas, of Scholasticism. For some, Scholasticism has a bad name, but it need not. Scholasticism is a method. It's a means of intellectual inquiry. And it's not fully developed with Anselm, but he's considered one of the forerunners. What do we mean? Well, a method that deals a lot in questions and answers. So we'll see with Aquinas. This whole book is question, answer, objection, objection, response, secondary objection. So it's very dialectical. It's very orderly. There are many careful distinctions. It's called scholasticism because it will be associated with the schools, with the universities. This was not the kind of lay-level, popular sort of how you're going to do your group Bible study. It would take the humanism of the Renaissance to try to reintroduce some of these things. But it was most appropriate for professional scholars and monks and educators and teachers. This scholastic movement gave rise to the creation of universities 100 years later, and there are already some teaching taking place in Bologna and in Oxford, two earliest universities. And in scholasticism, what we see in Anselm is an elevated use of reason. Reason as a handmaiden to theology. That's often the image that was used. So not autonomous reason, not sort of emptying our head of knowledge of God from Scripture, but coming alongside to support what we know from the Bible and refute those who contradict the Bible. So an elevated use of reason. Let me mention a few of Anselm's key works. You can go online and you can have this at your house in 2 days off of Amazon. This is Oxford World's Classics, Anselm of Canterbury's major works. So it's it's not real attractive font here. It's a little small, but 500 pages, and you can get the major works of Anselm, and I'm going to just mention 2 or 3 of them. During his years at Bec, remember, he was the teacher there and then the abbot there, he wrote a number of important works. His most popular in his day were his prayers and his meditations. He also wrote 2 significant philosophical works during his time at Bec. They have a very attractive name of Monologion, and then the sequel, Proslogion. So the first word, the afterword. Anselm wanted to call them an example of meditation on the meaning of faith, Monologion, and then faith in quest of understanding, Proslogion. This one, the first one, was really a meditation on the essence of God, on the divine essence. And the second one was really about reason and what it can do to assure us that God is and what he is like. At the beginning of Proslogion, the second one, Anselm puts down for the first time one of his most famous phrases, and he's really borrowing from Augustine. Fides quorens intellectum. Faith seeking understanding. He writes in the first chapter, quote, I do not try, Lord, so much of this is written as a prayer to God. I do not try, Lord, to attain your lofty heights, because my understanding is in no way equal to it. But I do desire to understand your truth a little, that truth that my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe so that I may understand. This is massively important and represents, I think, the best of medieval scholasticism, or what would become medieval scholasticism. Anselm says, I am not trying to argue my way to God. I'm not starting with autonomous human reason. He is not a rationalist, as we would have in the Enlightenment. But he does believe that Christian faith is rational. He starts with faith. He believes the Bible. He believes the truths handed down to him by the church. And from that position of faith, he seeks understanding. If Anselm is remembered for one thing, it is his argument for the existence of God in proslogion. Anselm looks at Psalm 14:1. You know that? Psalm 14, or Psalm 13, it would have been for him in the Vulgate. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. So you would have to be a fool to not believe in God. So Anselm, faith-seeking understanding, sets out to show that even fools should believe in God. And you would have to be beyond foolish not to recognize that God exists. And so Anselm gives what has been called to, now is handed down to us, as the ontological argument. He gives it in many different ways. Here's how he says it in chapter 2. Listen carefully. Even the fool, so he's referencing Psalm 14, is forced to agree that, now here's the key phrase, and just, you have to, in this translation, all these words are connected by hyphens, so it's one thing, all right? Something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, since he understands this when he hears it, and whatever is understood is in the mind. And surely, that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. For if it exists solely in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. If then, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, this same, that than which a greater cannot be thought, is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. Perfect. Sounds confusing, but it is really elegantly simple. If I say to you, there is something than which a greater cannot be thought. Hey, think of it, and there's nothing greater in its perfection and its being and all of its attributes. There's nothing greater that can be thought. Okay, right now you're understanding the concept. So Anselm says, okay, you heard it, you understood it, therefore it's an idea in your mind. Well, it's true, he is assuming certain Greek philosophical assumptions about reality, but most of us, I think, would agree they're rather commonsensical assumptions. If I say, I have the greatest of all possible horses, and you say, show it to me, and I say, well, it doesn't exist. And then you say, well, here's the greatest of all possible horses in front of you, you would say, that's a greater horse. That greater horse that exists, that's greater than the one that doesn't exist. So Anselm's argument is that than which nothing greater can be thought. If that thing does not exist, then therefore it's no longer the greatest that you could think of, because you can think of something greater, namely that same thing that exists. So there must be a being greater than which nothing can be conceived, bound up in this very greatness. It must be a thing that exists. Now, one of the objections is, okay, so are you saying, Anselm, that whatever is the greatest thing I can think of, that must exist? Because I can think of the greatest elephant. I mean, it can fly with big ears, and it's got laser beams, and it's got dragon scales, and that's a great elephant. Doesn't it exist? Well, Anselm kind of deals with this objection. He says, think about the lost city of Atlantis. this mythical utopian island at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. He says, no, that's the greatest island you can conceive, but it doesn't exist, because the argument does not say the greatest thing of any class would exist. He's not saying the greatest island, the greatest elephant, the greatest tree, the greatest frog, not the greatest thing of a class, but that than which nothing greater can be conceived. See, God is not in a class. I'm not saying that if you just think of the greatest thing, it must exist. But if you think of that thing, which there is nothing greater, it must by necessity exist. Anselm does not think he's proved the Christian God, but he thinks he's proved that only a fool cannot believe in God. He's not reasoning his way to faith. Remember, fides quaerens intellectum. He says later, quote, I give thanks, good Lord, I give thanks to you, since what I believed before through your free gift, I now so understand through your illumination. He says, I believed, of course, you existed, but now I have a reason to believe. Perhaps even more important than proslogion is Anselm's later work, completed during his first years as archbishop. Some of you may have heard of this, and sorry, half of you can't see the board very well. Cur Deus Homo. Why God, man? The question Anselm proposes is this, quote, by what logic or necessity did God become man, and by his death, as we believe and profess, restore life to the world, when he could have done this through the agency of some other person, angelic or human, or simply by willing it? Anselm's asking the question, why did God have to become man? Couldn't he have forgiven us with an angel? Could he have just substituted a human, not a God human? Could he have just willed it? Isn't he God? Can he just, blink, nod, sins are forgiven? Why was the incarnation necessary? Well, Anselm develops this argument. He says God cannot simply will forgiveness because sin deserves punishment. God cannot just tolerate what is unjust, and what is more unjust than that God should be dishonored. But man cannot repay God the honor he deserves. Even if man could do something that truly honors God, he would have, nevertheless, all of his previous debts of having dishonored God, and all he could hope to do was perhaps meet God's standard with a particular action. He can never make up for all of the demerits that he's incurred. So he says, penance won't do it. Good works won't do it. We can't make a recompense for our sin. He says no angel can do it. They don't have the same nature that we have. And he says only someone of a divine and human nature. Quote, it is necessary for one and the same person to be perfect God and perfect man. Now, of course, from our vantage point, we'd say, well, that all seems very obvious and is in the Bible, and it is in the Bible. But Anselm is the one to make a real advance in the theological articulation of the atonement. In fact, he says the devil cannot receive the recompense. Some of the early church fathers had a ransom to Satan theory, that the atonement, that Christ's sacrifice on the cross, was a payment made to the devil. You know who also had that view? Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. On the table, that's a payment to the White Witch. I'm not saying that's the only view that Lewis had, but for all of his greatness, Lewis rejected penal substitutionary atonement, and it shows there in the Chronicles of Narnia that the atoning sacrifice that Aslan makes is paid to the White Witch. Anselm says, no, the recompense cannot be paid to the devil. The restitution must be made to God. He articulated in the clearest way since the New Testament a satisfaction theory of the atonement. Now, it's still focused on honor, as you might expect in a kind of feudal system, but it's a satisfaction theory of the atonement that now, especially for Protestant evangelicals, seems as plain as day to us. Now, before we finish with Anselm, I'll skip over a couple of other works. We need to say more about his ecclesiastical career and then try to draw some summary statements. It's easy to remember Anselm just by this. Wow, this is brilliant stuff. And even today, people still grapple with this. Philosophers still read this, that Anselm was brilliant in his genius. But it's easy to just think, well, this is Anselm, just kind of, just 500 pages of stuff, there it is. But he was completely enmeshed in all of the hurly-burly ecclesiastical issues of his day. Remember, he is archbishop from 1093 until he dies in 1109. Now, he did not want to be archbishop. Now, we've seen this many times, haven't we? Chrysostom did not want to be bishop, and Augustine did not want to be bishop. Gregory the Great did not want to be the pope. Charlemagne, well, okay, he did want to be in charge. But these bishops did not want to be bishops. Why? They wanted to have a life of contemplation. They all loved the monastery. Now, you might say, well, they're somewhat just fulfilling a type. They all kind of realize, no, I don't want the bishopric. Well, there's some of that, but no doubt this is very genuine. And you can understand, even though the monastery might seem cruel and unusual to us, if you want to learn, if you want to write, if you want to have peace and quiet and order and 3 square meals and have your life set out and you want a life of prayer and contemplation, of course, you want to be in the monastery. But over and over again, and we'll see this with Calvin, God pulls these people into the messy service of the church. So he becomes, although not without difficulty, the archbishop. He says later in a letter, I am so harassed in the archbishopric that if it were possible to do so without guilt, I would rather die than continue in it. Part of Anselm's hesitation was this man we introduced earlier, King William Rufus. Remember, he's the second son of William the Conqueror. Robert, you get Normandy. William Rufus, you get England. So he's the king in England. And it's only when William Rufus is struck by a severe illness that people take to be a sign from God that he agrees to appoint Anselm as archbishop. But even then, Anselm professed his unwillingness to serve. The bishops actually dragged him to the church, pried open his hands, put the pastoral staff in his hand, and consecrated him right there against his will. And Anselm cried out the whole time, it is a nullity that you do. The first consecration, Anselm considered null and void. I didn't want this to happen. You put it's your big brother. Why are you punching yourself? Why are you punching? Why are you the archbishop? Okay. Even before his second official consecration, Anselm and the king were at odds. There were 2 main issues. One, Anselm wanted to secure the recovery of the Canterbury lands. So the church had a lot of land ownership, which had grown under Lanfranc. Remember, that's his predecessor. And he wanted to secure these lands. But the king, of course, he wants the lands for himself. So any responsible church official wants to try to get the lands back. That's one. 2, Anselm asked the king if he would accept his advice in all things pertaining to God and to Christianity. Anselm says, I will hold you as my earthly lord and protector. So you'll be the sovereign, I'll be the vassal. But, O king, you need to consider me your spiritual father and the guardian of your soul. And I say, well, maybe sounds reasonable. But what Anselm was really expecting is that they would rule England as co-equals. Anselm's first biographer was a secretary of his named Eadmer. And Eadmer says that Anselm expressed his church-state philosophy like this, quote, so this is Anselm thinking of his relationship to the king. You must think of the church as a plow, and in England, this plow is drawn by 2 oxen outstanding above the rest. And these 2, by drawing the plow, rule the land. The king and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The king rules by secular justice and sovereignty, and the archbishop by divine doctrine and teaching. Anselm, through his whole life, held tenaciously to this, might call, 2 oxen view of the kingdom. We're yoked together. The Archbishop of Canterbury was a singularly important position. Just to zoom out, think of the context here. Remember Charlemagne, my wonderful map of Europe? You know, that Frankish kingdom, now the Holy Roman Empire, never included the British Isles. And in fact, under the Roman Empire never went to Ireland. It never went farther north than Hadrian's Wall. So the British Isles had always been kind of a realm set apart. That's what happens when you're islands. Britain, Ireland, and Scotland had been a metaphorical and sometimes a literal outlier to the rest of Europe. And it's tempting here to think about Brexit and all sorts of other things that still resonate 1,000 years later about how should Britain think of themselves with relationship to Europe. Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury was almost like another pope. In fact, according to one of the earliest historians, William of Malmesbury, who lived around the same time as Eadmer, Pope Urban, so he's the pope during these first years, Pope Urban II. Pope Urban is said to have stated at the Council of Bari about Anselm, quote, "Let us take this man into our world, for he is, as it were, the pope of another world." That's Britain. It's another world. Eadmer says Urban welcomed Anselm to Rome in 1098 by saying, quote, "We regard him as if he were our equal, just as by right or even by law he should be venerated like the apostle and the patriarch of another world." One historical record of the time described Anselm as Anselmus Papa. That's just Latin for Pope Anselm. The title primate, which just means high-ranking church official, not monkey, the primate of all Britain occurs in every written profession to Anselm during his time as archbishop. According to Eadmer, Canterbury was, quote, "the very mother of the whole of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and of the adjacent isles," meaning the Orkney Islands. In other words, within the Western Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury was practically another pope. And Anselm, like Lanfranc, considered his position to have the spiritual welfare of all of Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and the surrounding islands. This meant the king should listen to the archbishop as his chief advisor in all matters. So that's how Anselm saw things, not how William Rufus saw things. And as long as he was on the throne, there was a constant chess match between king and archbishop. One of the sticking points, which will seem strange to us, but I hope it'll make sense. One of the sticking points was whether Anselm would be allowed to go to Rome to receive his pallium, not Valium, pallium. Pallium is a liturgical vestment, just a little collar thingy that a bishop or a pope, an archbishop would wear. So he wants to go to Rome to get his pallium from Pope Urban II. Now you might think, big deal. Go give the man his little doohickey that he can wear. But not so fast. The king did not want him to go to the Pope. Why? Because King William Rufus had not recognized Pope Urban. Remember, you had all of that with all the popes. You got Gregory, and you got Clement, and then you got Pope Urban. It's all a big mess about who is the Pope. Well, William Rufus didn't recognize him as the Pope. So if he allows Anselm to go, then Anselm is forcing his hand to recognize the Pope. And to make it worse, if he receives this honor, this vestment from Pope Urban, then William Rufus is acknowledging that Anselm is the archbishop because the Pope put him there. When William Rufus thinks, no, I am the one who decides who gets to be the archbishop. So this little thing about who gets the pallium. Now the king is smart. And as Anselm is sending some of his men to get the pallium, the king brokers a deal with the Pope that he would recognize Urban as the Pope if he would give the pallium to his men and bring it to the king. Okay, I'll give one of these. Okay, you can be the Pope, but you bring me the pallium. So they brokered a secret deal so that now he has the pallium. So I'm the one, Anselm, who gets to make you the archbishop. See, the Pope, you might think, well, the Pope is on Anselm's side. Well, the Pope, he apparently didn't like that he had to depend upon Anselm for all of England to recognize him as the Pope. So when I said it's a two-way chess match, it's actually a three-dimensional chess match. It's between Anselm and the king and the Pope, all sort of jockeying for who really has the authority. Well, William Rufus was in a relatively strong position, so much so that Anselm was exiled. His position was desperate until William Rufus died. The next king is Henry, not Henry IV, that's from Germany. This is Henry I of England, and he's a much weaker king in a weaker position. And so eventually he gives in to most of Anselm's demands. And by the end of his life, Anselm had won almost every privilege he wanted for Canterbury from the king, and the next pope is Pope Paschal, the 1L, Pope Paschal II. So didn't get what he wanted from William Rufus and Pope Urban II, but Henry I and Pope Paschal II, Anselm ends up on top. He did not want to be under the thumb of the papal monarchy. It's sometimes called during this time, the Gregorian reforms. Remember that Gregory VII, he was the pope who made Henry IV stand out in the snow. Gregory VII instituted a number of reforms. Some of them we'd say were good. He was against simony, that's the selling of church offices to the highest bidder. But he also was very insistent on clerical celibacy, which had never been firmly established. And he was against lay investiture, we saw that. And he was for a kind of papal monarchy. He wanted the Pope to have more control, and Anselm didn't like this. One of the things, just to point out as a Protestant, is this idea that the Pope in Rome would have authority over the whole church. We're 1,000 years in, and there's a whole lot of people who don't agree with this. Anselm doesn't agree with it. The East doesn't agree with it. In fact, you could say the idea of Roman supremacy is about one of the most divisive ideas that's ever existed in the history of the church. Constantly dividing that Rome would have this supremacy. By the end of his life, Anselm had gotten most of what he wanted. From the question of church lands to lay investiture to the ideal of being an equal oxen plowing through England, Anselm proved to be a shrewd ecclesiastical politician. By his piety, his intellect, his stubbornness, his good reputation, it was very difficult to cross him. In fact, not only did he essentially reign as a co-equal with the king over England, he also maintained some control over Normandy, because remember, Beck was in Normandy. And so he's got all of his connections there, beloved in the monastery. So he's kind of a co-regent in England and maintains some control even in France. No one would accomplish what Anselm accomplished. This would prove to be the high point of Canterbury's glory and prestige, but would further cement for Britain and for Europe that the two were not exactly the same. One scholar says this: Anselm brought to fruition almost all of the program conceived and initiated by Lanfranc, from his co-rule with the king to his independency from papal power. Canterbury's power spread all over the British Isles, from England to Wales to Ireland to Normandy. He even put forth a claim to the Orkney Islands. So let's bring this to a close. Eadmer says, Anselm, quote, died as dawn was breaking on the Wednesday before the institution of the Lord's Supper on April 21 in the year of our Lord's incarnation, 1109. The 16th year of his pontificate, interesting he calls it a pontificate, and the 76th of his life. His contributions were in word and deed. Just think about his intellectual achievements. Anselm shows us the power of thinking long and hard. He had many fewer books than I have in my library up in the White House. Might have had fewer books than some of you have in your home. He didn't know Greek. He had very little access to Aristotle and Plato. What did he have? He had the Bible. He had the Western Fathers who wrote in Latin, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, the Venerable Bede. But his gifts were his piety and his clarity. He was godly, hardworking, sincere, brilliant. And though he was famous in his own day, no one could have known just how influential he would be, that even 1,000 years later, they're publishing his works over 500 pages. Philosophers are still wrestling with his ontological argument, still wondering, does the argument work? Maybe it just does. And all of us are beneficiaries of his Cur Deus Homo and his doctrine of the atonement, which has become at the very heart of Christian worship and hymnody and preaching and expression. And then you have everything that he did. In 1979, then Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, said this: "We commemorate today the greatest of the archbishops of Canterbury, Anselm of Bec. He served God as a monk, as a man of contemplation who led many and still leads many in the way of prayer, as a loving pastor, as a profound thinker, and as a courageous statesman." So 5 things. To excel in 2 or 3 of these is not rare in the history of Christianity, but we see Anselm using all 5 talents to the full. And it is remembered not only that all these talents were his, but that these aspects had an inner unity and were all of one piece. So for all Christians, West and East, Roman Catholic and Protestant, Anselm should be remembered as one of the great theologians, great churchmen, and one of the great spiritual examples in the whole history of the church. And you can go forth in the next 20 minutes and see if you can find a hole in the ontological argument. So see you there in the next 25 minutes.